Now, I would like to take a minute to discuss exporting. Exporting your project is the final step in turning your project into a file that can be listened to by others, as well as burned to a CD. Once you're finished with your project and you feel that it's done, you can click on File in the File menu panel and then select Export. Then, you can choose what format you would like to render your project in. I would strongly suggest always using WAV as your final format, as it is virtually identical in quality to the original format. There is no compression in a WAV file, so it will not lose quality like a format such as MP3. Once you've chosen your location to save the file to, you will then see the Export Options panel, which allows us to change some options. To begin, we see an info panel, which shows us some basic information about the file to be created. We can also choose to output multiple different types of file formats at once by left-clicking the icon beside each of the formats to activate them. You'll notice that if you select more formats, the file size will change in the info window. In the WAV panel, we can select what our bit depth is going to be. The options that we have are 16-bit, 24-bit, and 32-bit. Now, it's beyond the scope of this tutorial to explain the difference in bit rate, but you can look at things in terms of quality. A 32-bit file is going to be of better quality than a 16-bit file, but its file size will be about double of that of the 16-bit file. Now, when I mention quality, you have to keep something in mind. A commercial quality CD that you buy in a store is encoded at 16-bit. So with that in mind, choose your bit rate wisely. A 32-bit file will be increased in quality, but this increase isn't necessarily something that you will even be able to detect with your ears. It takes some real analysis to start determining between bit rates, and some other audio programs will not even work with 32-bit files, so be careful. My rule of thumb is to export anything that you plan to edit later or in another program as 32-bit. Then, when you render your final file, render it as 16-bit. This way you can keep your quality as high as possible throughout your editing or mixing process, and then once you're finished with everything, export the final render as 16-bit WAV. The looping mode window gives us some options for how we're going to export our file. The options are Leave Remainder, Cut Remainder, and Wrap Remainder. Leave Remainder will export your project or loop so that the file will cut off once the very last note stops. This mode is best for exporting either an entire song or for exporting separate tracks for use in other programs. The Wrap Remainder and Cut Remainder options are usually best for creating loops. Wrap Remainder will take any kind of tail on your audio and wrap it around to blend in to the beginning. This works best when you have effects like reverb or delay that trail out after the original sound. This will create a smooth loop that plays with no abrupt stops. The Cut Remainder option does exactly the opposite. This will cut the file at the end of the pattern or song without any regard for any trailing effects. Now, something else to point out. You need to pay attention to the mode that you're in, either song or pattern mode. If you only want to export the current pattern as a loop, make sure that you're in pattern mode, but if you want to export the entire song, make sure you're in song mode. Of course, to check this, look at the mode indicator which we discussed earlier, but you can also check the info window which will tell you what mode you're in. The next set of options we have are for MP3 or OGG Vorbis encoding. You can raise or lower the bit rate for your render if you've chosen MP3 or OGG format, or both. I would suggest using the highest bit rate, which is 450 kilobits per second for OGG and 320 kilobits per second for MP3. As you already know, MP3 and OGG are compressed formats and therefore degrade your sound quality. The highest you can get your bit rate, the better. I would recommend using MP3 format for quick renders to use for demo purposes. I would never recommend using an MP3 as a final render or as a sample format. You may come across friends using FL Studio and inserting MP3 format samples into their projects. This can work, but I wouldn't use MP3 samples as important pieces in your project. Also, if you have an MP3 sample in your project and then export that project as an MP3, you will have further degraded the original sample. Next, we have the quality options. The first option is sample or interpolation. I would recommend using the highest setting, which is 512 point sync. Again, without going into detail about what sync is, the basic premise is that the samples in your project will be analyzed at a higher level and will have a more accurate waveform. Keep in mind, this setting is different from your live setting in the audio settings. You can keep your live audio at a low level, like linear, yet render at a high level, like 512 point sync. This is great because it uses less CPU while you're actually putting your project together and then gives you a high quality render for your final export. The dithering option is an option that will only be available in 16-bit wave mode. Basically, dithering is a way to keep errors out of your audio. It works by randomizing quantization in your audio by rounding the numbers that represent our digital audio to different amounts within our 16 bits, and therefore we end up with fractions. So instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have 1.3, 2.3, 3.4, 4.4, 5.5, and so on. This ultimately helps to reduce harmonic distortion. Again, this is something that is beyond the scope of this tutorial, and I would urge you to research the subject of dithering for yourself to determine whether or not you should use it. The alias-free TS404 option will anti-alias or smooth out the digital sound of the TS404 if you're using it in your project. HQ for all plugins will make sure high-quality mode is turned on for all plugins that support it while being exported. Disable Max Poly will disable your maximum polyphony setting and allow for all notes to play at once. The max polyphony setting is helpful if you want to limit the number of voices being played while composing your project, which will save CPU, and then you can disable max polyphony in your final render to make sure all voices play in the final render. Finally, we have an options window. We can choose to split mixer tracks. This option will export all of the mixer tracks that have audio running through them. This is a great way to split up your project into individual pieces for use in other programs, or perhaps to bring back into FL Studio to mix. I use this sometimes if I have a very CPU-intensive project that really loads down my computer. I'll assign each channel to a mixer track, then use the split mixer track options to export. Then I can start a new project, re-import all of my files as audio clips, and put them in the playlist. Then I can mix without having to deal with all of the heavy effects or VSTIs that were causing me problems before. Save Acidize will allow you to export a WAV file that contains the tempo information. Acid is a program produced by Sony and uses loops to create music. This option is good if you're using Acid or if you're producing loops for people who are using Acid. This option does not change your audio in any way at all and does not affect your ability to use the file in any other application. Save Slice Markers is again an option that will export any slice markers you have in your project. It will automatically create slice markers for each note in the file, which is great for exporting drum loops to re-import into SliceX or Fruity Slicer, as they will already be marked for slicing. Finally, we have a new feature in FL8, which is delay compensation. When this option is on, it will ignore any delay compensation setting you have in the mixer. With this option off, the track will be delayed by the amount of time you have set, if any, in the delay compensation in the master mixer track. This applies only to WAV files and will allow you to compensate for any delay in your project caused by plugins that introduce it. This option may not apply to you if you're using mostly VST effects or VST instruments, as delay is usually introduced by hardware. When you're ready to render your file, you can press Start and you will see a progress bar that shows your progress. You can also choose background rendering, which will minimize FL Studio and render your project while leaving some CPU for use with other programs. This is a good option to use if you have a file that's going to take a long time to render and you still want to be able to use your computer. So as we've just seen, there are many options available to us for rendering, and I hope that I've been able to give you enough information to make your choice in how you export your project. Remember to experiment with different settings and formats to see what comes out and what you think works best for you. Thanks again for watching.